Sarah.
Melissa.
What are we reading today?
We are reading The Guest by Emma Cline.
Can't wait. Sarah, I'm curious about your process for selecting a book. Is it spontaneous or is it premeditated? A combination of both? How do you pick what your next read's going to be?
I really think it's a combination of both. It kind of depends on where I'm at. You know, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about everybody saying, "Oh, it's on my TBR, to be read list," which I didn't even. This is I'm an old lady living, I don't know, under a rock. But at first, when I saw TBR, everybody, "Oh, my TBR," I'm like, what is that? And then I'm like, oh yes, of course, to be read.
In the last episode, I tried to throw it in, I really knew what I was at, and I was like, oh, I used the wrong letters. So yeah, we're both new to this lingo, but
I know
we're all in.
Yes, we certainly are. But yeah, I don't necessarily always have a to be read list going on, and I'm not necessarily strategic about how I'm reading something or when I'm reading something. Sometimes things just fall into my lap. A good example would be after our reunion last summer, and you were sending me titles of books oh, this was good. And I'm like, I'm going to read that because I didn't have anything just kind of waiting in the wings. Okay, I guess I'll read this next, or something would, pop up on my screen, on Instagram. And I'd be like, oh, that looks interesting. I'll read that. I mean, there was a period actually last year where I went to the library with my son, didn't really have any idea of what I wanted to read next, but knew I wanted to read something. The only name that popped into my thought process was Emily St. John Mandel, because I had read a couple of her books more recently. And so I went up to the library and I was like, do you have any books by Emily St. John Mandel? And they ended up essentially giving me all of the books. And I ended up reading her entire catalog last spring. But I just was like, well, I might as well just keep reading them. Some of them they had to request from other libraries, but I didn't tell them no. I was there just oh, you want me to request that one? I'm like, okay. And so I ended up reading, all of her books. It was 6 books total that I ended up reading of hers. So it can be very random. I will say in the fall, sometimes I want to read something a little bit on the spookier side. So that's it in not quite a nutshell, much bigger than a nutshell. It's a little of both. Sometimes it's random. And then sometimes this year, I feel like I'm going into, each month I have an actual to be read list. So I am kind of checking things off, but then something might pop up that I don't have on that list. And I'm like, oh, I'll read that. And there's no order to it. I'm just okay, I'm just going to read whatever kind of seems like it comes natural.
A friend of mine loaned me a book and it's the Emily Henry People We Meet on Vacation. And I could not bring myself to read it because I was not going on vacation. And so I was like, no, this is a book that must be read on vacation. And I could tell that she had read it on vacation. And she even kind of joked to me. She's like, yeah, it's still a little bit wrinkly from the pool water. And I was like, I need to read this in a pool. I cannot read this on dry land. So it just kind of sat there to the point that she was like, can I have my book back? I'm like, yes. And I feel really, really badly about it. I really do. But it felt like a vacation book. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. And actually that I just came back from vacation about 2 weeks ago. We went to St. Augustine, Florida, little kind of winter escape. And I was, of course, because why wouldn't I be? I was sick leading up to us departing for this vacation. And so, I mean, my packing was totally off. And then I had all these ambitions of oh, I'm going to bring a couple books with me. And then all I brought was the book I was reading, which I had a chapter left. So I literally finished the book the first day that we were there and then didn't end up getting any other books. So I essentially was there on vacation, with much more free time than I would normally have. And I had no books to read. And so the day we got back, or the day after we got back from the vacation, I took William to the library to return some of his books that we had for 3 weeks. I was like, I got to get a book. And then I ended up getting the book that we're going to talk about today, The Guest by Emma Cline. And what's so weird about it, I just randomly got this book. It was on my list as well as a couple of her other books. And that was the one that I just was like, oh, I'll get this one. I totally would have and should have. And it's totally a vacation read. Totally a vacation read, especially if you're at the beach. And I was literally at the beach. I could see the beach from my room and I didn't have this book. And I ended up reading this book the first day that we were back. Read the entire cover to cover, which I don't get to do very often, but I just like blew through it. So
maybe it allowed you to extend the sort of beach vibes. Like, you were on the beach and then you were still so close to that beach experience that then continuing to read was like maybe a way to keep the vacation going. So,
well, yeah. I also think because like so much of the book kind of takes place on the beach, like there's so many scenes that are on a beach. And it was so fresh in my mind. Like I had been on a beach like 24 hours before I had started reading the book. So whereas like normally in the middle of January, I live in Northeast Connecticut, like, I mean, there's no beach happening. I felt closer to summer in a weird way because I had just come back from like a warmer climate and had been on the beach. And so I was able to kind of just really dive into the book that much more.
the smell of the sea and the salt air was still on your skin and in your hair, adding to the ambiance of Emma Cline's The Guest. So let's get into this in earnest here then. Can you give us a summary of this book, of The Guest?
Sure. So The Guest is about Alex, who is a 22-year-old sex worker, and it follows her along the course of approximately 1 week, like the last week of August. Alex is in a relationship at the very beginning of the book with an older, wealthy man named Simon, and she is literally his guest at his swanky Hamptons home in Long Island, New York, for the month of August. And he kind of unceremoniously dumps her. And although there are signs along the way that it's going to happen that she's maybe not quite aware of. And then the rest of the book really is just the days after this and kind of what she does, not really having a place to stay and remaining in Long Island. And it's a very anxious read, I would say, because of that kind of unstable environment that she's in. But yeah, the action of the book is really 1 week in Alex's life at the end of August in Long Island's wealthiest community.
Can I ask a few questions? I want to flesh out Simon for a second here.
Sure.
So you said they're in a relationship, but ultimately he's compensating her for this.
Well, what's interesting is even though she's a sex worker, and it's alluded to throughout the book, her relationship with Simon is not a financial one, or at least on the surface is not a financial one. She refers to him as a civilian. So when she meets him, she doesn't meet him in like a business situation where he has paid for services that she is willing to provide. She meets him when she's really down on her luck at a bar, and she meets him in like a normal kind of dating situation. Now, whether or not he really kind of knows deep down that she's a sex worker, that kind of is up, I guess, to the reader. But at least the nature of their relationship, they go on dates throughout the summer months that she describes. And then towards the end of July, right when she's truly at a low because she's just been kicked out of a shared apartment that she's been in. She has no money. He invites her to stay with him at his beach house for the month of August. And so when we really meet her at the beginning of the book, she's just spent like, say, 2.5, 3 weeks living at this beach house with him. And they're in a dating kind of relationship. And she's really putting her chips on that this is going to be something that has a future. And so she is kind of looking to this as like a source of stability and someone that she can be in a relationship with, but also be taken care of and not having to rely on sex work for her livelihood.
He's not married, I'm assuming.
He's not married. He's divorced. He has an adult daughter, both of which don't live with him. And it really is within the first chapter of the book that he dumps her. But he does, going back to kind of the whole idea of payment, like he buys her a new wardrobe when they go out to the Hamptons. So all the clothes that she owns are now clothing that he's bought for her. And I do think that that's an important point because it comes into play later on when she's no longer living with him.
Some real Pretty Woman vibes.
Yeah. But like much like the much darker version of Pretty Woman. One of the things I didn't mention initially was the reason why it takes place over a week is because he has an annual Labor Day party. And this is a week before that party when he dumps her. But he says something offhand to her, probably just to brush her off. Like, we can talk in like a week. And so when she leaves, she gets this idea in her head of like, all hope is not lost. I can still redeem this relationship and I will go to this Labor Day party. She lives in New York City, but she wasn't going to go back to New York City. She's going to stay in the Hamptons waiting for this Labor Day party where she envisions that they are going to reconcile and she'll be back in.
I did in anticipation, in advance of this conversation. I read a few reviews. I listened to a few podcasts talking about the book. Haven't read the book, so I just have kind of like some superficial information about it. Opinions about this book are divided, and they seem to be divided largely based on how people feel about spending this much time with Alex. Either they really enjoy this sort of window into her sort of chaotic, use the word anxious sort of lifestyle, or they kind of hate spending all of this time with this person who's very sort of anxious and chaotic. So I guess, like, which camp are you in? What was your relationship with Alex? And do you think that that is indeed why opinions on the book are diverse?
I can definitely see why they are kind of divided. When I read this book and then immediately after and thinking about it, it made me think of you actually, because one of the things that we've talked about multiple times, both here on the podcast and when we were having our little personal chats, is this idea of like character and character development and growth over the course of a narrative. I feel like you wouldn't like this book because there is no growth with Alex. She's not a likable character. You do, in a weird way, root for her. At least I did, because I was on the edge of my seat thinking like disaster was about to happen to her. Violence was going to happen to her. Or she's going to get arrested. She's going to, you know what I mean? And I didn't know. And so that's what really propelled me through the book, the sense of like kind of impending doom, this underlying anxiety that's like residing in the narrative as she's kind of, a lot of the reviews were like, she drifts and grifts her way through Long Island or through the Hamptons. And she's a bit of a cipher. Like, you don't know all of who she is or what's really motivating her other than like a sense of survival. Like, she certainly is a survivor. That's the one thing that I think comes across. I could see people being like, ugh, she's a downer of a character. She's not a likable character. Yet we're spending all of our time, like, this is what the book is about. It's about this experience that she has.
Just going back to this whole character growth thing, because I know sometimes I do like kind of land on this, but I feel like my feeling on it is that authors don't owe us character development, right? Like, if that's not what this character would do, if they would not be the type of person who would develop and grow and learn from their experiences, then they shouldn't write them in that way. However, if we're not getting character growth, and we need something else then in the story, right? And so it sounds to me like, because this is so in her world, in her head, in her perspective, you're getting neither growth nor something else. And maybe it might kind of be a little bit stagnant there. Am I kind of projecting too much?
I think so. I think among the kind of divided responses to this book, the crowd that's going to say like, okay, we didn't like her and nothing happens. What's the point of this? Why did I read this? But the way that I'm viewing it, that kind of stuck with me, is I do kind of in a weird way feel like it's a commentary, a criticism of kind of this culture around wealth in a weird way, like especially a place, and I don't know how familiar you are like in pop culture or even like, geography with like the Hamptons. And the Hamptons is not only like a physical place, but then like also kind of a concept or an idea or an ideal. But I feel like the setting is purposeful. And I feel like what happens with her, specifically the kind of different kind of not set pieces, but like the different locations and the different situations that she finds herself in and what she's able to do in those situations, I think that's what to me is like the meat of the book. That's what's making me think. Who she is, where she is, and what she's able to do are all really important things. And they do have a point, and they do have some sort of a comment on where we live or what our culture looks like.
Do you have an example from the book of how, maybe it's like, is it like a pivotal moment kind of thing, sort of an ensemble moment that you could share?
From page 1, Alex is always thinking about how other people are viewing her. And especially within this environment. The first page, she's swimming in the ocean at a beach. She thinks to herself, and this is, I'm going to start reading a small quote. Don't worry. Keep it conservative. And so she thinks, what would they see if they looked at Alex, all these people who are on this beach? In the water, she was just like everyone else. Nothing strange about a young woman swimming alone. No way to tell whether she belonged here or didn't. And then there's a whole kind of piece after that where she marvels at the fact that on this beach, you've got all these beachgoers in and out of the water. All of their belongings are just left unattended. Their shoes are at the end of the kind of wooden walkway up to the sand, like expensive shoes. Their purses, their wallets, their cell phones, their watches are just strewn about on these beach blankets with this idea that nothing would happen to them. Their cars are unlocked, often with their keys in the car. And these are like, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in terms of like cars. And so the fact that she's thinking about that, and she's always thinking about who she is or what she looks like and how does she blend into the environment, is from page 1 of the story. And that continues throughout. She's constantly in every new situation adapting to the environment that she's in and thinking about it. And like, what do I need to do so that I look like I belong here? There's another piece. She's thinking about a party that she went to with Simon while they were still together, and she's talking about the hosts, which are this wealthy guy named not Joyce, that's my mother-in-law, George.
What sort of Freudian slip was that?
Not at all. She's like the nicest person in the world. But so the hosts that evening were George, and then he has like a former model wife that he lives with, and she talks about the wife. Everybody's getting served sorbet, and the wife gets served blueberries, and she just eats them one by one and whatever. But Alex recalls all through dinner, she, the wife, had barely spoken to Alex, her frail, nervous energy aimed at her husband. George hadn't spoken much to Alex either. Alex was a sort of inert piece of social furniture. Only her presence was required, the general size and shape of a young woman. Anything beyond the fact of her sitting in her chair and nodding along was a distraction. I don't know. I feel like those pieces are connected. Something about like the privilege of who she is. She's a 22-year-old, we assume, white woman, tall, pretty, not pretty enough to be a model, which that leads me to believe she like has a whole section where she kind of talks about that. And it sounds like she isn't originally from New York City, but moved there at some point, maybe right after high school. And that maybe she went there to try to be a model and it didn't work out for her. And then sex work found its way for one reason or another into her life. I think her age and I think her appearance allow her entry into these kind of forbidden spaces or at least spaces that are exclusive, that are only for certain people. Like she can fit in as the young girlfriend of a wealthy older man. And she can go to those dinners and just kind of be like a inert piece of furniture blending into the background. But she also can show up in these other spaces. She can show up with high school students. She can show up with young professional 20-somethings. She can show up as a nanny or an au pair at a beach club.
Do we know anything about her upbringing?
Nothing. I can't think of any point in which she like talks about like her parents, if she had parents, siblings, nothing. She does recall back to lessons that she's learned from other girls who I'm assuming had kind of mentored her, she had worked with, and the life that she was living just prior to meeting Simon, but that's as far as we go back.
Did you find yourself as you were reading trying to fabricate a history for her?
In a way, yeah. You can just see the destruction that she leaves in her wake. You can see how little a care she has about the people that she interacts with. She really is almost looking at these situations from like a parasitic point of view. Like, what can I get from them? What can I gain from this situation? When you're looking at a character like that, you're thinking like, well, what is the motivation other than desperation? and then what leads you to feeling desperate? And, was there a history of a troubled or traumatic, young life that then led her to make some of these decisions?
For me, what goes hand in hand is, you've already brought up both of these points, but you just use the term desperation, but earlier you used the term survivor. And to me, those two things are so linked, right?
Yeah.
I'm really struck actually by how much this character, having not read the book, reminds me of Trinity from This Is How
Oh,
We Love. And
yeah.
when you started talking about the scene where she's floating in the water, and remember early on when Trinity's at the beach with her mom and her mom's boyfriend, and
Mm.
she's kind of observing the beach, but she's a child and she's starting to go out to sea. And like, so initially I got that Trinity kind of like feeling from you. But then the more you were describing, I was like, I could really see the similarities. And what I think is funny is you were talking about this being a commentary on wealth. And I live in a small, remote city in the North Atlantic. There is a cap to how much wealth I'm exposed to. Like my version of wealth compared to the version of wealth that people in your part of the world, even, and certainly neighboring regions would see as very different. So I wonder too, if this hits a little closer to home for people who might be able to like connect with, oh, I know a guy like Simon. I've seen a guy like Simon with his young chicks, like the social furniture, like that must be something very present, something very tangible for people who are exposed to that level of wealth that I just couldn't quite get to. And that's why I was like, oh, this is what Trinity is, because she lives in my world, with that ceiling of wealth available.
I didn't think about that perspective, but I guess she's a quick study, right? Again, a survival trait, like always being hyper aware of your environment and what you need to do to remain safe. And I like the idea of associating her with Trinity, because it would make her like more likable in the sense, because I actually had like a really like, I had a lot of feelings for Trinity. I felt so sad for her and like where she ended up and how she ended up there. There was one scene. I don't want to give away, like I did kind of give away like different scenarios that she finds herself in, but there was one scene in particular that I think like left such a like uneasy feeling. Like it was a very uneasy read, that section for me, and it left like a bad taste in my mouth after I read it. And it's at this beach club that she finagles her way into by posing as a nanny. And so she kind of steals a child to do this. I know you're making a face right now. And yeah, that's how I felt when I read it. Yeah, he's like a 6-year-old boy. There's like something almost sinister in the way that she's able to kind of coax him over. He wanders off from like his actual nanny, and she sees him and she starts talking to him. And then, in the club, it's like one of those places where if you're a member, you go in and it's just charged to your account. And so you get whatever you want. You don't have to pay right there up front. And so like, it could be anything from like, soda and burgers and fries and ice cream, beer, that kind of thing. And so she kind of like gets him to think that she knows his family. And he goes in with her, and she kind of promises him that he'll get an ice cream if he comes in with her. And basically she goes in there because she wants to eat. She has, I don't know if that night she was I think she had actually slept indoors. There was one night out of the 5 or whatever nights that we read about that she actually ends up sleeping like in a little wooded area off a beach because she has nowhere to go. But I don't think it's the day after that. But in any case, she's hungry. She's thirsty. It's hot. And she wants to get into this club. She also has a phone that at the very beginning of the book gets like a little swim in the pool. And so the phone is like barely functioning at all, no charge on it. And so she's constantly looking for a place to plug this phone in. And so her thought is like, I want to get some food. I want to charge this phone. And then again, like the opportunity of all these items left unattended at people's tables and people's lounge chairs. Like she has free access to this and can take whatever she wants, whether it's money or jewelry or medication, because she is always in search of getting some sort of a medicated, high. Now they're in the pool. As a mother, I'm always thinking like, oh my God, like I'm so afraid of a kid drowning. Like that's like, that's in my top 3, like ways that I'm like most scared of losing my child. But, and so they're in this pool. Now she's been drinking beer, like, and then she's chatting with the sister, and then they get up and go somewhere, and the kid is left unattended. And then she has this one fleeting thought as she's walking back, because she doesn't think anything about it when she leaves him in this pool. And yeah, she's walking back and she has this moment of like, oh no, like he could be at the bottom of the pool right now. And like, she's just like, what would I do? And but of course, I don't know that she's thinking about him and worried about him, but I think she's thinking about it in the context of like, what would happen to me then? Like, what would I then have to figure out and do? If that had happened, because it doesn't, I don't want to, put that on any reader's
This
mind.
is an
Like,
anti-spoiler
yeah,
alert.
yeah, that
Here's
one
something that doesn't happen in the
I
book.
feel safe about, kind of giving that one away. But had that happen, I think she would have just like backed away and then just like slithered out. After I read that whole thing, I was like, again, nothing really happens, but it's the thought, it's the prospect of what could happen. I feel like that plays time again, but in different ways that have a different comment on like the ways that she's able to like get into these exclusive environments based on how she looks and how she's able to adapt herself. And the clothing that Simon bought for her, importantly, plays a role in that, because if she did not have the right clothing, even if she was young and pretty, she probably wouldn't be able to get past the velvet rope in certain environments.
It's just showing that Simon is perpetuating a cycle, right? And she's 22 years old. She's effectively a child. She's probably the same age as some of his children.
Yeah.
And so by him feeding into the tools that she needs to continue this lifestyle, he is just continuing to ensure that there will always be sort of another generation of females who are in this precarious situation. Yeah, it really places blame on him in that kind of artistic way.
Yeah. There's two different scenes where people are on beaches or in spaces where they're not supposed to be, and she watches how these interactions happen. First, she's at this party with Simon, and there's a couple that wanders onto a private beach, and they're just kind of having fun on the beach. And the owner, the woman who owns that private stretch of beach, looks out haughtily and is just like, look at them. I bet they're having fun right now. And then sends some security guards to kick them off the beach. And they like laugh about it. They think it's hilarious. Now at the club, she watches another person kind of wandering in a space where they're not supposed to be in, and what happens when they're kicked out. And so the book says, Alex hung off to the side. After a while, she could tell which people walking past would veer up the steps and into the club and which people would not. The club looked sparse, almost military, but no matter. It didn't make a difference what was behind a rope, really. It just mattered that there was a rope. The people on the terrace needed the people walking past, just as the people walking past needed the people on the terrace. The only drama came when an outsider stopped to rest in the shade of an umbrella and sat down on one of the beach chairs. The woman glanced around, face open as a dinner plate, trying to understand where exactly she had found herself. Not a minute passed before a man in a polo shirt came over and bent down to say something to the woman. Alex watched this happen, watched the error being corrected. Like the couple at Helen's party, ejected from the sphere where they didn't belong, only this woman was apologetic, eager to participate in her own removal. I thought that was kind of like an interesting observation. It just kind of, again, speaks to forbidden spaces. I keep calling them forbidden, but they're not really forbidden. They're just exclusive spaces. And the need for there to be a line between them and a delineation between the types of people who can be on one side or on the other. And the fact that she can move back and forth across them just because of her sheer like cunningness and, ability to blend in, as the social furniture.
I love the two sides of this concept too, because one is exactly what you're saying, right? That she's able to camouflage or chameleon her way into ensuring that she can find a sense of belonging in multiple environments. But it also really highlights that we do socially segregate. And I think to myself, this velvet rope, everyone seems to know exactly who that is dividing, who that is excluding, without any kind of signage, right? We think back to like the 60s when things would have literal signs on them, whites only, for example. We would, at that time, people were open about these are the people who are coming in and these are the people who aren't. And yet we still are doing this.
Oh,
we just
100%.
took the signs down, right?
Mm-hmm.
The barriers are still there. The signs are down. And so in some ways, do we work harder as a society to just make sure that we're more nuanced about the ways in which we segregate our communities? And that she's able to kind of navigate both of them, I find is really interesting. And the way that it's layering the concepts of wealth in this story too, I think is really interesting. I must say I didn't know what to expect about this book, but I'm becoming more drawn to it as a potential to put on my TBR. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And it's funny, like when I'm reading books, I'll often think about it. It takes me right back to one of our first grad seminars when we were in, the Canadian fiction course, and we were required to write responses to every single book that we read. And then we would share these responses, along the table. And I'm always thinking about books in that way now. Like, what would my response to this be? What would be the thing that when I think back to my experience of reading it, that I grabbed onto or grabbed onto me and hasn't let go? And that was like immediately upon closing the book, that was my thought, was like, if there's anything to be taken from this book, because I think you could argue, and people probably have, like, this is a book that's not worth reading, or if this is a book worth reading. And I think that that's ultimately what it's trying to say, is it's a commentary on wealth and those spaces that there's a line right in the middle that you can go in or you can't, depending on who you are, what you look like, or how much money you have. Have you ever watched The White Lotus? No. I feel like you guys would love it, you and Tom. There's been 2 seasons so far. The first season takes place in Hawaii, and the second season takes place in Italy. They take place at like essentially a hotel, like a 4 seasons, like really swanky hotel in these spaces or places. I'm thinking about spaces so much, spaces and places. So the very swanky hotel, very exclusive hotel. And then the whole season of the show is about the different people. Some of them happen to be people that work at the hotel. So again, they're from probably like a certain socioeconomic demographic. And then it's the guests and the different types of guests and the different types of wealth, like new wealth, old wealth. It's a satire, and it's hilarious. The things that the characters act out, or I feel like you and Tom would like really get a kick out of it. But this most recent season set in Italy is all about sex. Like, that's kind of the overarching theme. But like, sex as a commodity is part of it. And there's a sex worker who is one of the prominent characters, and she's not supposed to be at this hotel, but she's there because she's the guest of someone. Going back to the title of this book, being a guest. What does that mean?
Yeah, right. It definitely suggests you are not inherently meant to be here, only because you've been invited. And can people revoke invitations when you've been brought into a space or to a table?
There is, like, when I think of the word guest, like a temporary nature to it. You can't be a guest forever. And if you are, you're a problem, right?
Then you become something else at that point. We've long been drawn to these types of stories. Like when you were talking about The White Lotus, which I definitely want to check out now. Upstairs, Downstairs, Downton Abbey, even the Titanic story is so much about who was in what room and what happens when they mix and mingle and the sense of belonging. We've talked about that so much in several of the books that we've discussed. Like, I think a feeling of belonging is so important to people that's why books explore it so much. But you started to allude to something earlier. You said about if this is a book that people should read, and I can't help but feel like that's a nice segue into an important question. Sarah, I would like to know, is The Guest by Emma Cline a could read, a should read, or a must read?
It's a should read. I'm sticking with should read, because I mean, if I read it in a day, like, I feel like if you're laying on a beach blanket this summer, this winter, going on vacation, it's worth a read. It's a quick read. It'll get you thinking. I think you could either love it or you could either hate it, but take the gamble. I think it's worth the gamble. And I feel like it's a richer text than on the surface it might appear to be. It isn't just a beach read. I think that it has more to say too, and I think it's worth reading. So that's why I'm calling it a should read.
I like it. And I like the idea that a beach read doesn't have to be just, total candy that you just eat and forget about it. Use that time of your beach read, your solitude, your maybe additional free time to consider something. Don't just feed your brain something easy. Feed it something that it can chew on and produce some good thoughts about. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for this conversation. I wish you a glorious Super Bowl Sunday.
I know, we didn't even talk about it. Wonder why.
I don't know that we'd have much to say.
Yeah.
As those two teams face off against one another, we wish them all good luck and safe travels to Taylor Swift from Tokyo.
Yes. Well, this was a blast. Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing about your next read. We'll leave it to be a mystery. What will it be?
It's TBA, to be announced.
Perfect.
Awesome. Take care.
You too. Bye.